We would be discussing on from Arnold to Wilde. And for this very discussion, we have once again with us Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya. Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya is a highly acclaimed academician who is loved by the students both in India and
to Victorian criticism. Victorian criticism is important because for the first time in the history of English literature, we had on a very large scale practical criticism. Theoretical criticism has always been there because every age, with every new movement, there has to be some sort of manifesto. How is it different from the earlier one? So, to explain that, each group of poets, particularly the leading ones, they gave their manifestos, like Wordsworth and Coleridge did, preface to lyrical ballads. Similarly, Dryden, Pope before them, they had given. Now, the Victorian leading poets like Tennyson, Browning, then Arnold, see, they had their own idea of what is poetry. So, obviously, they also had to sell it to the people, the new idea of what is meant by poetry. So, for the first time, the emphasis came on criticism of life, so much so that Matthew Arnold defined poetry as criticism of life. Before that, you would recall during the Romantic age, criticism was taken negatively. Criticism was taken as something inferior, something which has nothing to do with the world of poetry. That is why when Scotch reviewers gave a harsh criticism of the English poets, Byron hit back. He wrote a poem called English Bards and Scotch Reviewers. So there he makes fun of the Scotch reviewers. So criticism was not taken kindly. Criticism was taken to be that I am being disliked or fault finding is being done about my poetry. That is how the response came from the practicing poets. But now it became almost equally respectable profession to be a critic. That is why the leading critic of the age, Matthew Arnold, could write so much. 2 series of essays in criticism, and both voluminous. So that gives an idea how things had changed, and criticism had become a respectable activity. People took it seriously. People waited for the new critical essays to come so that new ideas would come. So, here began a sort of debate among the practicing poets and other intellectuals, readers of poetry. Criticism has its positive side as well, in fact, more positive than negative. It is not just fault finding, it is working towards excellence, perfection, how to improve the art that you are practicing. So, wherever you find that somebody is failing in a particular aspect of poetry or literature, then there is nothing wrong if you point out in writing. So, that is how it began, and it became acceptable to all. Before the Victorians, it was not really acceptable. So, if we call the Victorian age the age of criticism, it will not be wrong, because for the first time we have criticism as an activity which is equally prized, equal to the creative art, and people look up to the critics to guide them as to what to look for in a poem, in a creative composition. So, the beginners of Victorian criticism were poets like John Stuart Mill, not really a poet, but more of a critic. John Stuart Mill, and then Thomas Carlyle, then Matthew Arnold, so on and so forth. So, there were several major critics of the age. No other age had such a large bunch of first-rate minds, great minds, engaged in writing about poetry. Earlier, they wrote poetry, but not about poetry. Now, these very poets are writing about poetry. What is poetry and what is good or bad in it? So, this practical criticism, so to say, began on a large scale in the Victorian age. And the first in this context is John Stuart Mill. He wrote 3-4 essays. First was, what is poetry? So he defines there what poetry is. Second is, two kinds of poetry, that it is not just one kind. There are different kinds, depending upon what you are writing about, depending upon in what mode or style you are writing about. And then the third one Mill wrote was Thoughts on Poetry and its Varieties. So, from one poetry to two kinds of poetry to varieties of poetry. So, that is how he expanded the critical view of poetry and made his readers aware of how critically you can look into a poem and find points of appreciation and points of depreciation also, faults. So, both virtues and faults you have to look for in any given poem. That became the format for practical criticism. These essays Mill had written 1833. Formally, 1837 is the year when we say the Victorian age began, because Queen Victoria got onto the throne that year, and she had the longest period right up to 1903. So imagine 1837 to 1903, such a long period, the Queen of England. Here comes John Stuart Mill just a few years before that, but then he lived a long life. How does he define poet? He says, whom shall we call poet? His definition is those who are so constituted that emotions are the links of association by which their ideas, both sensuous and spiritual, are connected together. So that is the definition of the poet. Here is an ability of the mind which is not available to everybody. Only the poets have it, he says. And what is that ability? That through emotions you are able to assimilate ideas and assimilate them into making it a complete whole. So all put together, a separate identity also, but combining to form a new structure altogether. So that is how Mill looked at emotions and ideas in a poem. So those who are so constituted that emotions are the links of association by which their ideas, both sensuous and spiritual, are connected together. In other words, in the case of a poet, it is the emotion which is central. Ideas are secondary. Ideas are to be accommodated through emotions. That is why it is poetry. Otherwise, prose is there. You can straight write about your ideas, but that will be an essay, not a poem. So in poetry, you do express your ideas, but you do that through emotions, means through some experience, not as a direct discussion of ideas, but as an experience of life. So you filter those ideas through the emotional experience that you have had. That is the difference between ideas in poetry and ideas in prose or essay. Now, Mill wrote two important things where you have these ideas about poetry. One is Signs of the Times. Signs of the Times. This is Thomas Carlyle, because Mill I have already mentioned. The three pieces that he wrote. Three pieces were what is poetry, two kinds of poetry, and third, thoughts on poetry and its varieties. Now the second in line among the Victorian critics was Thomas Carlyle. And Thomas Carlyle also wrote critical pieces, one of which was titled Signs of the Times. So you can see that poetry is not something confined to itself, something apart from general life. These Victorian poets and critics, they never separated poetry from life. That is why it is defined by Matthew Arnold as criticism of life. So poetry is about life itself and nothing else. Therefore, the two are inseparable. They are so aligned